Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we have something special, a King Seiko Special from 1975. Actually the last version of King Seiko that was ever made. So without further ado, let's get going. It does run, but now the hack has stopped the seconds hand. We see that the date changes, the weekday changes. Let's try the quickset. The weekday quickset is as expected, but the date quickset actually winds the watch while you change the date. So that's a bit odd. We see the time graph is actually quite okay. Parallel lines, not too crazy. A little bit low amplitude, but that's fine. Not too bad beat error either, so yeah, just probably needs a service. So let's get to it. Given that the King Seiko was a bit of a competitor with the Grand Seiko, they both typically came with gold medallions in the back. But this version has a pretty plain back. The rotor is just screwed on rather unceremoniously, but it works. It's ball bearing rotors, that's a good thing. We can just use our tweezers, no need for any special tools here. Get the spacer ring out and take the crown out, and then we can uncase the movement. It is beneficial to take the rotor off first, because then the movement will lie a little bit flatter. And if you want to put it in a movement holder, it's also easier without the rotor. Alright, we see that the dial is in very nice condition. Let's then just align the hands so we can take them off with the levers. And the dial has a bit of an interesting mechanism as well. What you would find in old watches are these dog screws that sort of cut into the dial feet. And that is the same kind of thing you have here. But then again, ETA started doing more or less the same thing with their clips. So it's a little bit in between old and new. Let's get the dial off and place it safely. And the spacer ring, let's also put that together with the dial. And there's a C-clip holding the weekday disc in place. Let's just take that one off without losing it. That's also a pingable object. With the weekday disc off, we can start studying what's happening on the dial side of the movement. Now, first thing to notice is that this movement has a rocker, but also a sliding pinion. The quick date setting looks quite normal, but then as mentioned, when we set the date, we actually wind the watch at the same time, which is a bit odd. And then we have the regular hand setting. We have one wheel with two fingers for both date and weekday. And another thing that's really striking is the finish, or the lack of finish. That is really a Seiko thing as well. There's no real finish to things. It's just, finished in the machining. But then they put on these sort of random gold screws to, I don't know, maybe make it nicer. So we take off these flaky little plates and then see what's underneath. There's one of those gold screws. Better keep that one. So someone made this joke that if you have a Patek Philippe and you take away the finishing, what are you left with? A Seiko. And it's a little bit true, of course, that Seikos are very unceremonious in terms of the finishing, but they are highly functional. On this watch, you see pretty much the only finishing of any mention is on this 3/4 bridge. By the way, we need to take off the automatic module, or at least break the chain, before we can run down the mainspring. So let's do that first. Then we can turn it over again and unwind the mainspring. Now to wind down the main spring, we're actually going to use a screwdriver on the screw, and that's alright, even though we would normally use the crown. But the crown is connected through this rocker, and the rocker is held down by these plates, which we just took off. Of course, that's why the cutout inner plate is there in the first place, so we could use the crown, but anyway, it's fine to use the screwdriver like this. Let's take off the ratchet screw and the ratchet wheel. Now we have this nice long click there. Another thing that also sort of characterizes Seikos is the number of parts they manage to squeeze into the keyless works. If, let's say, a simple watch has maybe a little bit over 100 parts, screws included, then a Seiko has maybe 250 parts only in the keyless works. So I'm of course exaggerating a little bit, it's probably more like 240, give or take, on average. Now since we're rambling on about Seiko, let's just get the last two off the chest as well. One is plastic parts, which we're actually spared for in this watch. And the other is the exaggerated amount of jewels that they put in some of these movements. We mentioned in the Longines 341 video that there are actually 5 ruby balls in the ball bearings that they didn't count in a jewel count. But some Seikos have these random jewels here and there, and then they all of a sudden have like 35 jewels, which doesn't really do anything, except maybe increase import costs here and there. Now we started taking off some of the keyless works. Take off the date lever. Then we can take off the rocker. And there's a little wigwag underneath the rocker as well that meshes with the ratchet wheel. I'm not sure why they did it this way. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. It doesn't add a lot of functionality. It doesn't reduce manufacturing costs, rather the opposite. It certainly increases fragility when you have a lot of small parts that need to work together to achieve simple things like winding the watch. But it is a fun movement. Very different from your boilerplate Omegas, that's for sure. And please don't get me wrong. Vintage Seikos are fantastic watches. The King Seiko, the Grand Seiko, the Lord Matic. There's a lot of things to love about old Seikos, and new ones also. And you typically get a lot more for the money when buying a vintage Seiko than buying, let's say, a vintage Rolex or a vintage Omega. And these watches are just as good, if not better. Now, meanwhile, we come to the keyless works. Started taking off the different pieces here. Actually almost finished. That's how time flies when you ramble on. Now you might also think, huh? Why take everything off on the dial side? Well, the thing is we don't really have too much use of the crown anymore because of the way it's constructed. So we can just take everything off and then go to the train side. Now, if anything, the train side is much more conventional. It has a pretty big sort of 3/4 plate instead of, let's say, Le Pin bridges. And it does not use the Seiko Magic lever for some reason. It's more of a conventional reverser wheel that we already took out. And it also has a few extra jewels. We see these cap jewels on the escape wheel, and the fourth wheel is really not necessary. Let's check that the wheels have the right end shake and side shake. Don't really expect there to be a lot of problems, given that the watch was running fine, comparatively. So let's just unscrew everything and see what's hiding underneath. And as mentioned before, when you're working on a new movement, it's very important to take a lot of pictures and make sure that you know how things go back. My habit ever since I began was to put the screws and the parts that belong together in one compartment in the tray. The screws don't go in the cleaner anyway, so then when the parts come out of the cleaner, we know the screws are matching the parts. One interesting thing here is that we see this long tension spring for the second pinion. It actually goes over the third wheel. And if this one is not properly adjusted, it might even slow down or break down the third wheel. So that's a lookout point. Also a lookout point that it doesn't clamp too hard down on the second pinion. Now under this little center wheel bridge we have the hack. The hack is actually a really big piece for some reason. It's again a little bit overthought, over-engineered. It works, but it's also known to be a little bit fragile. And another trademark of Seiko is, of course, these riveted wheels everywhere. Not to say anything bad about riveted wheels, but riveted wheels are bad. Let's not ping this spring either. And here comes the hack. Well, that pretty much completes it. We see there's a little bit rust there in the barrel cutout. We can just rub that off with some pegwood right away. Otherwise the movement looks very nice. Well, relatively speaking, obviously. As nice as the Seiko movement looks, without any finishing of any mention. Yeah, but the machine finished cutting. But on the serious side, if Seiko had spent as much time on finishing as the high-end Swiss brands, then of course the price would have been a completely different one as well, because the finishing costs a lot of money. That's a lot of handwork with people sitting there and making perlage and Côte de Genève or what have you. So I would rather have a great movement of high quality and then pay a nice small sum for it, rather than paying 100 times as much for the same quality, basically, that's just finished to a very high degree. So that is what's good about Seiko. Alright, let's put the balance cock back on. Let's take the chaton and the end stone out. And this is a Kif style thing, so we have to turn it a little bit more fiddly, but not too bad. Do the same on the dial side. And then we're ready to put pretty much everything into the cleaner. We just need to also look at the barrel to get the mainspring out and clean that one as well. Looks pretty dirty and dry. we see the mainspring has a kink in it, so we're going to have to replace it. For vintage watches, it's not necessarily what you always want to do, replacing the mainspring, I mean. For the reason that a new mainspring might be a little bit too strong in a sense. It will create a lot more wear in the wheels and pinions. And to be honest, you don't really need 315 degrees amplitude on a vintage watch anyway. It's not like people wear a vintage watch to have it run within +4 -1 seconds. Let's just finish up cleaning the barrel, and then we get all the different parts in our tray and get it ready for the cleaner. And voila, strip down complete. Alright, we got everything back from the cleaning machine. Let's start by having a look at the rotor, which has some aging spots on the metal. Trying to actually rub it off with a normal eraser, which often helps, but not here. And we don't want to damage this, so we're going to be very careful with this fiberglass brush. And just see how much you can get off with some different solutions. But it's not going to be ideal, but it looks pretty good in real life actually. Then we remember that the mainspring was kinked, so we'll have to put in a new mainspring. And when looking at mainspring, there are a few different dimensions we're looking at. The main being the height, the thickness and the length of the mainspring. So I found a mainspring that has the right dimensions, apart from being 2 centimeters too short, and that's fine. When putting it in, you might see that the mainspring is actually upside down. And the reason for that is that Seiko and basically non-European brands typically have the mainspring going in clockwise, whereas the Swiss and most European brands have it going in anti-clockwise. Worth to remember. Putting in the barrel arbor, giving it a little bit of oil. And then we can put the lid back on. Another thing we have to do before we can start screwing things together, or screwing them up a bit depending, is to oil the end stones for the shock settings. Now you might remember that this movement actually has end stones on a couple of other wheels as well. Those we're gonna oil from the underside, so we're not gonna dismantle them. And when you're doing so, you can either use the finest oiler you have, or ideally the automatic oiler perhaps from Burjon. So then we can put those back in, and then we can look at the train bridge. As you might remember, it's a 3/4 bridge for this movement, and there are 2 end stones that we want to oil here also, so we'll just do that from the underside. If you have an automatic oiler, that will help a little bit, but it's not a big deal. And then we oil the same corresponding end stones from the inside, if you will, also on the main plate. Alright, then we can start putting this baby back together. Our plan for assembly is basically to build the train side first, and then we'll put on the keyless works, all 240 parts there, plus a few other components on the dial side given the construction of the watch. Now, talking about the construction of the watch, I've gotten a lot of heat for saying that it has a rocker mechanism on the dial side for the winding. And I sort of hear you say, hey, a lot of heat, dude, you got like 5 views on this, and I'm sure one of them is yourself sitting in your little white office offering sacrifice to the porcelain gods. So how can you get a lot of heat? Well, to that I can only respond that the first point, yes, absolutely. And the second point, oh child, how much you yet have to learn about the ways of the humans. You see, when you get married, you first of all, you marry, of course, this beautiful, innocent girl. But there's a transformation happening in a marriage. And we're not talking about, let's say, like the aging of a nice wine. We're talking more Kafka. That beautiful girl that you married, she will turn into this vicious, vindictive wraith living only to tear you down every second of the day, including when you sleep, even if you might not know about it. And of course, one of the viewers of the video is my beautiful wife. And she correctly pointed out to me that, what do you call that a rocker? It's not a rocker. It's a minute wheel bridge with intermediate wheel for day correction. Part 387006. How many times do I have to tell you? Yes, dear, I said, but it's sort of rock. No, it's not rockery. Yeah, but it's a little bit rocker-like thing. No, it's a bridge. It has 2 screws. And she was right, of course, as she always is. Anyway, we put the train bridge back on. We make sure it's aligned with the pivots in the holes. And it's a good practice to keep a probe or something on top of it to hold it in place. Because if those pivots get out of the holes and we would then screw down, we're going to break the pivots. And that's going to be quite expensive. Finding new parts for a 50, 60-year-old movement is probably going to cost you like $50 just for a little wheel. So better safe than sorry. I put the crown and stem back in as well, just to make sure that the hack stays out of the way, which it should anyway, but still. Next we'll put in the pallet fork and the pallet fork cock. So in English we separate between cock having 1 screw and bridges having more than 1 screw. In French it's all bridges. Alright, so we're over at the dial side. Just pull the crown and stem back out again first before we start assembling things. I'll put on the click spring first, and then we can put on the ratchet wheel and screw it down. Remember this little spring for the wigwag pinion underneath the ratchet wheel. Now the ratchet wheels on these Seikos also have this little bit cheap feeling, because it's not a square hole as in most other watches. Only 2 of the 4 sides are parallel. It still works, just feels a little bit cheapo. And this is a left-handed screw, as indicated by these parallel stripes on top of the screw head. Give it a little bit extra wind, and we can turn the watch over and see that the pallet fork switches nicely from side to side. So given the way this movement is constructed, we do have to flip it over a few extra times, but that's just how it is. Doesn't take many seconds. 2020. Alright. Before we start putting the rest of the stuff back on, let's put some D5 or similar on the different posts to make sure we get as little friction as possible. It's quite common to have an oil sink underneath the minute wheel, so we'll have to oil that before we put the minute wheel on. And for this movement there are also a couple of oil sinks for the automatic wheels that are under the date driver wheel. So that also determines some of the sequencing of things. Okay, So let's put some grease on the winding pinion and a sliding pinion, so we can put the stem and crown back in. And then we can commence with the rest of the keyless works. And it's a good idea to put in the cannon pinion before you put on the minute wheel. For this watch you have to do it, but in general it's also a good idea. It really is a strangely designed movement in a lot of ways. On one hand you have nice long springs like the click spring, like the yoke spring, but then you also have these sheet metal cutouts and these weirdly overlapping things that Seiko loves to do. And of course you have this random gold screws for some reason. But it is more fun to work on different movements. And this movement really is different in a lot of ways. Alright, so we put on the setting lever spring, put some grease on that one so it slides a little bit better. Also very uncommon that we put the hour wheel on before we put on the rest of the keyless works. But yeah. The wigwag and the minute bridge. Yes. And we can then put on what actually is the rocker. It's the day-date corrector wheel. Rocker. And then we'll put on the date jumper. And then the cover plate. Now, as we mentioned in the strip down video, the minute wheel bridge has to be kept in place to make sure that the winding and so forth can take place properly. And it's held in place by those two cover plates. But given that we're not putting those on quite yet, we're going to simply put in the screws there just to hold the minute wheel bridge down while we do the rest of the stuff on the train side. So this is a movement that does require a bit more planning and sequencing than normal movements, if you will. And if you do this more regularly, then of course you probably can find better ways of doing it than I have. And it's not a very common movement, so it's not like you're going to work on it every day, or every week, or every month, or every year, or every lifespan. But it is a series of movements with the 5206 on that carries a lot of the same characteristics. Alright, so we flipped the movement over, put the balance wheel in, and it started ticking, so that's always good. Now let's try to see if we can get this baby running properly. First demagnetize the movement, always a good habit. And then we'll put it on the time grapher. Now you might remember from the strip down that the time graph was actually pretty good, and it's still pretty okay here. One thing I did notice when I was working on this is that there was a small couple of kinks actually in the hairspring. Very small kinks, so not like they're really going to impact the timekeeping, but they may make the graph look a little bit rougher. So when we're adjusting the watch on the time grapher now, the first thing we want to do is take out the beat error. We're just going to speed up the video a little bit. But you should see the beat error being reduced, and once that is reduced, we can start putting the watch at the proper rate. Now the amplitude is still a bit low at this point, and that's fine. We didn't fully wind it, And we also have to put in the automatic works, and that always adds a little bit extra. So we're seeing the beat error is gone now. Now we just want to make sure we have a pretty good rate. Just get it around level and we should be fine for now. We'll do a little bit more adjustment after the watch is assembled and cased. Alright, starting to look pretty okay. Yeah, now we can take it off. Then we'll put on the automatic wheels, the intermediate wheel as well as the reverser wheel. Fiddly fiddly. Then we can put the little bridge back on. As always, we'll make sure that the pivots are in the holes, that the wheels run freely. And of course that the reverser wheel does reverse the bidirectional movement of the rotor into one direction winding. Alright, then we can oil those two wheels as well. And that means we're pretty much finished on the train side. So let's flip again. And then we can oil those two automatic wheels before we put on the date wheel driver with the two fingers. Alright, then we're getting that wheel in place with the intermediate wheel. Also want to oil this date finger so that the finger can rotate smoothly on that little shim that is then screwed down. And testing. Then we can unscrew the minute wheel bridge again and complete the rest of the calendar works. Now in the stripped down video I did rant quite a lot about Seiko movements with the plastic pieces, with its cheapo stamped out sheet metal plates, with its random gold screws and so forth, but Seiko is really good quality, even though they have some quirks and some strange decisions. And they do just work, basically. And especially the King Seiko and Grand Seiko from the old days, but also the Lord Marvel, Lord Matic, what have you. Very, very good watches. And if maintained properly, they will keep running for 100 years. Not on one wind, but you know what I mean. So we're putting on the two cover plates. Remember the gold screws. And let's check that quick date setting works. Let's check that the manual setting works. Actually, one little good point I would say is that they have these two fingers for the date and for the day apart, which means that the mechanism doesn't have to cope with changing those two at the same time, as is possible with a lot of day-date movements. So that does spread out the burden on the mainspring a little bit. We're also oiling the date jumper with a tiny little blob of D5 or HB 1300. And then we can put on the weekday disc. You might have seen that we actually also did oil the jumper for this one very, very lightly. Testing time again. Alright, so we're getting closer to casing the watch. Put on the spacer ring for the dial and the dial itself. One thing I didn't properly record was putting the hands on. But we have shown that in other videos, and we'll show it in further videos down the line. You just have to trust that we actually did it. But before starting to put the hands on, we want to check that the quick set works still. There are sometimes issues when you put the dial on, especially if there is no spacer for the dial. So the hour hand is on. Now we want to double check that we aligned it well, so that the date changes at midnight. And then for this movement and most movements, we want to have the day change a little bit later. But the date should be around midnight, max 15 minutes earlier or later. But ideally, of course, spot on, but let's say 5 minutes to and fro. Same with the minute hand. We're also checking that the hands are parallel to the dial and not rubbing. And here we go. That was like 7-8 minutes before, but that is with moving the hands with the crown. And when the mechanism runs by itself, it will be a couple of minutes later, so that should still be within 5 minutes, so that's fine. Seconds hand on, and the watch is still ticking. For the case, we didn't really do anything to it other than clean it. It is very sharp and nice. We don't want to polish the case if we don't have to. And this case does look very nice, better in person than on camera. But it's still sharp and nice and doesn't look like it has been polished much at all. Last things we do, we put in the spacer ring and then we screw down the rotor. And given that it's a ball bearing, we're also going to oil it with the Lubetta V106. And the last thing we have to do now before putting the case back on and the straps on is to check the time grapher. We remember that the amplitude was a bit low, so we wound it a little bit more, and also with the automatic movement you always get a little bit more amplitude. And for this watch we're going to be happy with around 260. Alright, let's put the case back on. We have a nice black strap that we're going to put on the watch. And the end result is not too bad, if I may say so. King Seiko Special with the 5256A movement. Handsome watch. And that means we're finished with this lovely King Seiko Special. We'll be back shortly. Until then, ta-ta.